This first-century tomb has been identified by archaeologists as the family tomb of Herod the Great. It's also a picture of the kind of tomb that the New Testament links to the resurrection of Jesus, a resurrection that some say can only be a matter of faith, because history knows nothing of people who come alive after being dead for 3 days. But this group of scholars has come to a different conclusion. While acknowledging that the resurrection of Jesus is a matter of faith, they also believe that some seemingly incidental details of the gospel accounts actually have helped to convince them that the historical evidence for what happened on the 3rd day after Jesus' death is compelling. Jesus, man, Messiah, or more, the resurrection of Jesus on this day of discovery.
Ever since the first century, millions of people have staked their lives in their belief that after spending 3 days in the grave, Jesus of Nazareth rose bodily from the dead. Yes, many are skeptical, but because some have gone to great lengths to try to explain what really happened to the body of Jesus, we want to take another look.
For 2,000 years, the resurrection of Jesus has been the crowning event of the Christian faith. And yet the conclusion is not unanimous. Many continue to raise questions about the account of the resurrection as told by the 4 New Testament gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Together, the Gospels focus on a grave that probably looks similar to this first-century tomb. Many were carved into limestone. Sometimes a heavy round stone rolled to open and close the entrance. Inside these tombs, there was often a small room for family and other mourners. According to the Gospels, a group of women were the first to visit the tomb of Jesus.
Now when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices that they might come and anoint Jesus. Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they said among themselves, "Who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 16.
What we've learned about first-century tombs and burial customs can help us understand the resurrection story.
Most people don't understand Jewish burial traditions, and they are very important. First of all, when a person died in the days of Jesus, the body was washed, perfumed, wrapped, and then taken to the family vault the very day of death. The family then mourned at the graveside for 7 days. That is why the body had to be perfumed, because you can only imagine after a few days the odor would be very unpleasant. During the funeral, scripture would be read, hymns, psalms would be sung, there would be prayers, there would be grieving, and perhaps even music. When the 7 days ended, the funeral was over, but not quite. 1 year later, the family would return to the tomb and gather the bones of the loved one and place them in an ossuary or bone box. Sometimes the name of the deceased was placed on the box. And then the box would be placed in a niche inside the family tomb. Knowing these traditions helps us understand better that first Easter morning. When the women brought spice to the tomb, this is why. They were going to anoint Jesus' body so that they could grieve quietly at his tomb.
Dr. Craig Evans is one of a group of New Testament scholars who, for 10 years, have been looking at the historical evidence for key events in the life of Jesus. Together, they've recognized the historical significance of the New Testament account of the resurrection. Just opposite the old city of Jerusalem, we met 3 of the group at a grave that dates to the 1st century. This tomb, carved into limestone, has a rolling stone to guard its entrance. Archaeologists say that the tomb is likely a family grave for relatives of Herod the Great. Herod the Great himself was not buried here, but his tomb was recently discovered 9 miles south of Jerusalem at his volcano-shaped fortress palace called the Herodium. Ironically, King Herod, who tried to kill Jesus at his birth, was buried here near Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus, who, according to the Gospel accounts, is still alive. This study group wants to remove the doubts and questions that so many have asked by taking another look inside the historical evidence for the resurrection.
Okay, if I tell you I know nothing about this site, what's important for me to know?
Well, you need to know you're sitting in the basement of a famous tomb that everybody in Jesus' day would have seen. This is the traditional tomb of the family of Herod, Herod the Great. And what we are now is in the basement, and we can tell that we're in a basement. The top is gone, the superstructure. It used to be a beautiful monument, and we know that because of descriptions from people like Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian. And what you're seeing here is a rounded door that's been rolled aside so that people can go in and out of here to bring in their loved ones and lay them to rest and observe funeral rites and mourn right here in the tomb.
So it really is it's a great picture, the kind of tomb that we would read about in the Gospel accounts.
This is the kind of tomb that Jesus was placed in.
Okay, why have you men spent so much time talking about that?
Because dead people generally stay dead. We don't think about tombs going empty after 3 days. And this is part of Jesus' claim that God was going to vindicate him, that he was not going, this death, this sacrifice that he undertook was not like anything else that had ever happened before.
According to the Bible, Jesus' death happened at Passover, when a lamb was sacrificed, remembering the rescue of Israel out of Egypt. Jesus' death is presented by the New Testament as a sacrifice, not just for the nation, but for the sins of the world. And according to the Bible, his resurrection broke the power of death and sin, rescuing any who would believe.
Okay, but that's one of the most debated issues of history, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, you've got a lot of people who say, I take the Bible seriously. Of course he rose from the dead. But there's a lot of people, as you know, and I know that's why you've been wrestling with this, who challenge the historicity of the resurrection.
And they even start at asking, well, how do we even know where Jesus was buried? How do we even know he was buried at all? And it starts from there, and it runs all the way through till we get to the resurrection. There are little points of contention all the way through the story.
Okay, so whether or not it really took place, whether or not Jesus really came out of the grave 3 days later, is a huge issue.
Oh, it's at the heart of Christianity.
That's right. That's the whole thing. That's what it's all about.
The Apostle Paul, missionary of Christ to the Mediterranean world, admitted that there is no point in following Jesus if he did not rise from the dead.
But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. And if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty, and your faith is also empty. 1 Corinthians chapter 15.
The Gospels describe the moment the women entered the tomb.
And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter." The Gospel of Mark, chapter 16.
And from what I know of your study, what you've been trying to do is say, okay, if you accept the biblical text, you got a pretty clear description of what happened. But if somebody doesn't accept the text, and they're challenging the historicity of those events, Then we have to figure out how to talk to those people.
Well,
right?
actually, one of the interesting things is that we don't get a detailed description of resurrection. We get the detailed description of its effect.
That's right.
We get an empty tomb and we get appearances, but at no point do we get a description of Jesus ascending somewhere or anything happening to Jesus. So
Why is that important?
Well, it's important because I think if we were making it up and really trying to drive the point home, we might expect, in fact, in later materials, we get those kinds of descriptions. We move in those kinds of directions. But right here, all we get is women went to the tomb. It was empty. They were caught by surprise. They went back and told everyone else that the tomb was empty. The people hearing that story didn't go, oh, yes, of course, it was Jesus, no problem. No, they went, oh, these women are a little too upset. And then from there, the story follows out with this series of appearances in which people have to be gradually convinced that this actually did happen. They actually react like very modern people. You know, show me. I really don't believe this.
Now when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 16.
The story is so restrained. If anyone were making up a story like this in Christian circles, they would have had an elaborate resurrection. They would have had a great number of detailed events. And just the very simple story that we find in Mark and the others shows that they were not making up. They were really collecting what they had experienced.
For example, here's an odd fact. Peter is by far the most important of the apostles.
Mm-hmm.
You would think that at some point we would get a detailed description of an appearance to Peter. We don't have that in the Gospels. If you were making it up, wouldn't you have Jesus appear to the first apostle, to the one who made the great confession at Caesarea Philippi? We don't get anything like that in this material.
And James, who was the leader of the church at Jerusalem, all we know is that Christ appeared to him. Nothing from the stories told.
But what do you say if somebody says, but these sound like incidental details? These don't sound very important to me.
They're not. They're at the heart of the entire resurrection event.
Why?
Because these are the men who changed the world. These are the men who led the church. Peter was the rock. James was the elder of the whole church at Jerusalem. All the events in the book of Acts flow through these men. And if they were making up a story, these would have been incredibly detailed stories.
And instead of an appearance to Peter, what we actually get are women coming to the tomb to be the first witnesses. And in the ancient world, women, generally speaking, couldn't be witnesses. So you're making up a story, you're trying to sell a difficult idea, and the place you start in making up the story is to have women come to the tomb and be the first witnesses. It doesn't work. So you sit there and say, women are at the tomb because women were at the tomb.
That's right.
You know, it isn't a made-up detail. It's something that doesn't fit the cultural background. You start here because that is where the resurrection story started.
And all these little incidental details you alluded to, Mark, what they do, they're pointers to, I think, history, to authenticity. Not the kinds of things people would make up.
Yes.
And what these little details show is that the Gospels writers know what they're talking about and they're telling the truth.
History tells us about a lot of people who have died for their beliefs. The disciples of Jesus were such men. But what distinguished them from others is that they didn't just die for a belief. They died for their claim to have seen, heard, and touched Jesus after his resurrection. What history doesn't tell us about are people who have been willing to die for a lie. Many believe this building covers the site of the tomb from which Jesus rose from the dead. Here in the heart of the old city of Jerusalem is a landmark church. It's one of the oldest in the world, dating to the 4th century. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and claims to cover the sites of the crucifixion and resurrection. Exposed bedrock under an altar is the place where many believe the cross of Jesus stood. Inside a soaring rotunda, a rectangular structure covers this traditional site of the tomb of Jesus. The austere darkness and religious trappings almost hide the significance of this place, and yet millions come and are moved as they remember the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Interestingly, when the Gospels tell the story of what happened here, They don't hide the doubts and unbelief of the disciples. Reports of an empty tomb didn't change their grief and despair.
The disciples would have been changed remarkably. Instead, their entire reaction is one of skepticism, of doubt, and actual disbelief at every stage. We do not see a movement during the appearances.
But doesn't that work against the gospel story?
No, because it shows the faithfulness of the stories to the original event. Again, if it was written fictionally, it would have had, like all Roman stories, this magnificent movement, this incredible victory, this great force that has started. Instead, we
perhaps
have
an
doubt and
immediate
disbelief.
embrace of,
Yes,
of the
exactly.
story. You know, oh, of course, this is our Jesus. He's raised from the dead. We don't get any of that.
Mm-hmm.
The women go back. They tell their story. Those who hear the story go, they're just overcome with grief. This can't be right now. Granted, two of them do run out to check out what's going on, so they're enough disturbed by what's being said to go check it out. But it all takes a while to sink in because this doesn't normally happen. Dead people don't normally come back and talk to you. Dead people stay dead. And when they experience this resurrection, they're processing it. And we see that processing live and in color in the Gospels.
Jesus appeared in another form to two of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 16.
Unbelievers have their reasons. Since the exact location of Jesus' tomb can't be known with certainty, how can we be sure about what was written so long ago? People have reason to doubt, especially when it comes to the supernatural.
They just sort of assume, this is a part of history that we really can't know anything for sure about. It's probably a myth. And you're saying, no, there are elements of this story that don't sound like a myth. Is that?
Yeah,
Yes.
let me give you another one. You know, in Judaism, there was the idea that resurrection would come at the end. Everyone would be raised at the end. The judgment would be at the end. So Christians could have created a story that would have fit in the Jewish background very nicely that simply said, you know, at the end, God is going to raise everybody and Jesus is going to be in charge. Now, that would have saved them a lot of trouble.
Why?
Well, because they wouldn't have to deal with an empty tomb. They wouldn't have to deal with Jesus being alive today. It wouldn't be anything that was provable. It would just be raw hope. But no, what they do is they say, no, that tomb was empty. He appeared. You can't find him now. He's actually alive. And there's a lot that comes out of that because they've changed the story. They have a resurrection within history 3 days later. That's a mutation on the Jewish view. Where did that mutation come from?
The Jews demanded a conquering king. They expected that this Jesus, when he came, would defeat the Romans and begin the kingdom. Instead, he came to suffer, and his followers suffered after him. And the movement moved incredibly slowly. There was no massive movement of victory, and this could not have just been made up.
Okay, so you're saying that works for credibility rather than against it.
Yeah,
Exactly
absolutely.
right. Exactly.
Okay. Go ahead.
There are a whole series of these things that happen, and even some of the details that relate to how Jesus was handled from the burial to the resurrection, things that people complain about, actually, in fact, make sense. And we see these. Jesus is not undergoing a normal burial like Herod's family would have undergone, because he is a criminal. The body's got to be taken down quickly. We're towards the end of the day. The Sabbath is approaching. And from there, certain things kick in because he died as a criminal. And some of those details show up in the way the details are told in the story.
That's right. And then Thomas isn't there when Jesus does appear. Thomas's point is, I know all of you say you've seen him, but I refuse to believe until I can actually touch him. This is incredibly realistic. This would not have been made up.
And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, "Peace to you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here, and look at my hands, and reach your hand here, and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." The Gospel of John, chapter 20.
Okay, now if someone says, but I look at you, you're scholars, okay. These scholars who believe that the biblical account is historically credible for the reasons you've given. But they say, but I also know the world is full of scholars, men as intelligent as you, who believe the opposite, who believe that it's ridiculous to think that Jesus actually came out of the tomb. And they say, why would there be this huge difference? Why scholars on this side and others on the other?
Skepticism is very, very natural. It's very understandable. But I think most skeptics don't carefully consider all the facts, don't read the Gospels carefully, don't get into the historical and cultural backdrop. Those who do quite often are, like Lee Strobel and others that could be named, they are overwhelmed by the truthfulness of the account. And of course, the Spirit of God comes into play. A person who is open and wants God to show them the truth and carefully and fairly studies the Gospels, they become convinced.
Many scholars say that the discrepancies between the stories, like the different accounts of the empty tomb, are so great that it cannot be historical. When you look at it carefully, these discrepancies are not really discrepancies. They're authors' emphases in different areas, such as where did the women start in dark or did they arrive in light? Well, of course, they came at dawn, and that's a very simple one. But some scholars are looking for discrepancies, and they simply say every little detail is an absolute contradiction.
And remember that there's a worldview issue here, and the worldview issue simply is that dead people stay dead. And so the idea that something could take us beyond this life is like a ceiling that's put on the discussion, and you don't ever break through that ceiling. And part of what we're trying to say is that the nature of the details here shows that someone is crashing through that ceiling, and that ceiling leads to the living God. And only that can explain what actually emerged. The transformation of the disciples, which is often talked about, is just one part of that total story.
Okay, let me ask you this then. What would you want someone to do with this if they've got questions, they're intrigued by what you're saying, the case you're making, they still have questions? What would you encourage them to do?
What I normally ask them first is really to do what we're trying to do, to say, look at the event not as a religious claim. Look at it as a historical claim. Ask yourself the question, was there a Jesus of Nazareth who lived in the first century, who died on the cross and was buried, and then who actually historically, and we can demonstrate it historically, rose from the dead? And then think of the implications.
And then I would even personalize it to this degree. Think about what it must have been like to be a disciple of Jesus, to have walked with him over this period of time, to see him up there on the cross, hanging, dying, your hopes and dreams dissipating with him hanging on the cross in the midday sun. And then after that, to realize the disappointment that they had, and then all of a sudden to have that turned around, and your initial reaction is, that can't be happening. It's a very natural reaction. That can't be happening at all. But these men eventually became convinced and went out and took a message that didn't make sense to the ancient world, but believed it deeply. Why did they do that? Something caused them to turn in their thinking and to change the way they viewed the world.
Yes.
And what we suggest is that something was the resurrection. It was the empty tomb. It was these appearances that all of a sudden they said, our Jesus is alive. He's alive in a different way. And by a means that we had contemplated it, we looked forward to God raising people from the dead, but not now.
Mm-hmm. And the truth is, they'd expected nothing. I mean, Christ had told them that they never understood a word. And that change shows something had to have happened.
And you believe that can change people's lives today as well?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Thank you, man.
This garden tomb in Jerusalem gives us another picture of what the burial place of Jesus might have looked like. From all over the world, people still come to sites like this to reflect on the suffering and death of a crucified man that, according to the New Testament, a grave like this could not hold. And today, I personally stand with all who see the resurrection of Jesus as the source of our own hope, life, and freedom. Together, we put our faith in Jesus. Jesus, the man, the Messiah of Israel, and so much more.